Today we are beginning a series of lectures on the theme Post-Cold War Era Issues and Concerns. The theme will be divided into 5 segments. The first segment deals with from unipolarity to multipolarity, emerging powers. The second segment deals with challenges to the nation state. The third segment deals with the changing dimensions of security. The fourth segment deals with peace and development. And the fifth segment deals with restructuring of the United Nations. So I'm focusing today on the first segment, which, as I just mentioned, from unipolarity to multipolarity. Now, international politics is, as we all know, dynamic in nature. Developments that take place on a day-to-day basis, in fact, are very specific to that particular time, that particular period, and so on and so forth. But there are also turning points. Now, what I mean by turning points is that there are certain moments in international relations when actually, something happens, as a result of which the course of international relations actually changes quite dramatically. I can give some specific examples. For instance, the dropping of the atomic bomb by the United States on Japan, the 2 Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then in 1945, then the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1991, and of course the consequent Western military response. In fact, in many ways, that particular event ushered in the post-Cold War era, what we generally know as the post-Cold War era in 1991. Then even in the post-Cold War era, there have been such turning points. Especially, I would like to mention the attacks on the United States, the terrorist attacks on the United States on the 11th of September 2001. Now, that also has been a defining moment which has changed the course of international relations. Now, as we all know, that 1989-90 actually denoted the end of the Cold War. Now, what it meant actually was that one era was ending and another era was beginning, touching every aspect of international relations. Now, this aspect about change of an era is something that is very well known to students of history and politics. That, for instance, just to give you an example, say the French Revolution of 1789, that really changed the course of human history. So in that sense, we can say that 1991 also denoted a change of course in human history, which, as I mentioned, affected every aspect of international relations. In fact, it was felt that as a result of the end of the Cold War, there will be no longer any fear of a superpower conflict, which was actually a dominating feature of the Cold War era. Then, in fact, it was felt that there will be a durable peace, and so on and so forth. But experience in the last 25 years has shown us that those expectations have not been fulfilled. I will obviously go into greater details in this regard to demonstrate why those expectations were not fulfilled. In fact, there took place an emergence of new threats to peace. As opposed to what had been felt, that since the Cold War had ended and the superpower confrontation had come to an end, so there will be no longer the kind of threat to peace that the world actually had witnessed between 1945 and 1989. But that actually has not been fulfilled, as I said. In fact, in this regard, I should also mention the unprecedented advances in information and communication technologies, which actually you might think that should be seen as a boon to humanity. But as we will discuss in the other topics later on, these advances in information and communication technologies have not been an unmitigated blessing. In fact, in some respects, they also have been, in fact, a threat. Now we come to the question of unipolarity. Which is the principal subject of this particular lecture, unipolarity. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? Now, you all know that the Cold War era was known essentially as a bipolar era. There was the existence of bipolarity. Why bipolarity? In fact, there were two poles of power, one led by the United States of America, and the other pole was led by the Soviet Union. Now, when the Cold War came to an end, and this happened, of course, following the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, so clearly, one pole actually had disappeared. So obviously, this was the end of bipolarity, and the experts argued that there had emerged a unipolar world. Why unipolar world? Because the United States emerged as the sole supreme superpower, a powerhouse without any parallel or any competition. In fact, it was felt that the United States no longer had any competitor at all. The successor states of the Soviet Union, namely the largest state, that was Russia, obviously was in all kinds of difficulties, which we need not go into here, as a result of which it was in no position to mount any kind of challenge to the United States. In fact, if anything, at least in the 1990s, Russia became an ally of the United States, a partner in matters of strategic arms control, security of the North Atlantic region, settlement of regional conflicts, and so on and so forth. Of course, that situation has now changed. And as we will see, that in fact, Russia has now emerged as a competitor of the United States. There were also no other challenges. For instance, it was felt that maybe the Europeans, who had essentially been allies of the United States during the Cold War period, in fact, will also continue to be allies of the United States. Now, I'm not suggesting that the alliance between the United States and the Europeans actually totally broke down. That did not happen. But nevertheless, the Europeans, particularly the European Union, emerged as some kind of a competitor for the United States. But nevertheless, in fact, they were in no position to challenge the overwhelming military, economic, and strategic dominance and hegemony of the United States. Now, of course, there was a steady growth of Chinese power, but China was still unable to match the power of the United States. In fact, the third world was also in disarray. In fact, you may remember from your earlier studies that during the Cold War period, in fact, the third world had organized itself in the shape of the non-aligned movement, which was, although it was not entirely cohesive, but nevertheless, it actually had offered an alternative model of a grouping of states, of power, and so on and so forth. Now what happened was that as a result of the end of the Cold War, in fact, the non-alignment became quite irrelevant, and it was in disarray. Now, of course, you can understand why non-alignment became irrelevant, because after all, non-alignment was essentially born in a bipolar world. Their basic strategy was that they would not be aligned to either of the two blocks. Now, since one of the two blocks disappeared, the question arose, non-aligned with whom? So obviously, fundamental questions arose about the legitimacy of the non-aligned movement and so on and so forth. There was also the collapse of the socialist model. In fact, as a result of the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the replacement of the communist governments in Eastern and Central Europe, which actually during the Soviet period had communist governments and were aligned to the Soviet Union. Now those states actually all became democratic, pluralist states and adopted market economies. So, one can say that the socialist model, at least as displayed by the Soviet Union, in fact collapsed. And the free market ideology became the prevailing ideology. Now, of course, there was on the part of the newly emerging states or the newly emerged states, states which had emerged actually as independent entities following the end of the Second World War. Actually, they were busy to attract foreign direct investment. And the international economic organizations, particularly the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, continued to be key instruments in the hands of the United States to supervise the structural adjustment programs of these economies. Now I come to another aspect of it. Now, the U.S. victory in the Cold War, after all, essentially that is what the end of the Cold War essentially meant. The victory of the Western side as against the Soviet model and the Soviet bloc and so on and so forth. Now, it evoked both admiration and fear. Those actually who were votaries of capitalism, they felt that, the U.S. victory was a good thing for democracy, for free market, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, those actually who were not enamored by the U.S. so much, they were afraid. In fact, if you look at the arms export scene, this is a clear illustration of the U.S. dominance and the U.S. preponderance. In fact, the U.S. became the foremost exporter of arms to governments and groups. Despite, the overall arms exports at the end of the Second World War, at the end of the Cold War, actually, were more than halved. The U.S. share of arms exports during this period, I'm talking about primarily the 1990s, was almost 2/3 compared to Russia or China. Then there was a new focus on the role of the UN as well. As I mentioned in my initial remarks, that we will deal with the restructuring of the UN and reform of the UN in a separate lecture. So I'm not going into details on that. In fact, there was a lot of expectation that the United Nations now will act as the principal harbinger of peace and security. However, these high expectations were subsequently not fulfilled. Why they were not fulfilled, actually I will discuss that in my lecture on the United Nations. One of the reasons for that, I may mention in passing, was the overwhelming U.S. domination. Now, another very important facet of this, as I mentioned in my at the beginning, that the title of this lecture is From Unipolarity to Multipolarity. I think, as you can understand from the title itself, that the unipolarity, which of course essentially meant overwhelming American hegemony and dominance, that actually over the last 25 years has given way to a multipolarity, to a multipolar world. Now, why do I say that? Because of the fact that during this period there has emerged a number of powers, who are now referred to as the emerging powers. Essentially, I'm talking about countries like Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, India, Japan, and South Africa. Now, these countries actually have begun to play a fairly prominent role in international affairs compared to what they used to during the Cold War period. Now, so this you can say in a way actually was paving the way for the unipolarity giving way to multipolarity. In fact, these powers assumed new roles and used innovative diplomatic techniques in some very distinctive ways. And although, of course, it has to be mentioned at the same time that they also faced numerous challenges. Now, obviously, it's not possible for me to go into those details, but they can be taken up in another context by someone else. Another point I think that needs highlighting here is that there was an increasing assumption, there is an increasing assumption that unipolarity actually will ensure American predominance and dominance in international affairs as far as one can see. But as I have just mentioned, that actually did not happen. Of course, the United States continues to have a central role, though it presents a contrasting picture. American power actually, is gradually declining. Actually, this is something that, even American experts are now beginning to acknowledge. That, the United States, of course, will not continue to be as unchallenged as it was in the initial years of the post-Cold War era in the 1990s. But of course, that does not mean that America will not remain a great power. And in fact, America continues to remain the world's #1 power. In fact, it has worldwide interests. It follows policies designed to retain U.S. hegemony in the world. In fact, retaining this hegemony is one of the cornerstones of American foreign policy. For instance, the United States is militarily present in numerous areas of the world. In spite of its declared commitments to freedom and human rights, Washington actually continues to support authoritarian regimes in different parts of the world. The United States advocates free trade, but resorts to all kinds of protectionism to protect its own farmers and its own agriculture. Its aid to developing countries compared to the European countries continues to lag behind, considerably less than what America could actually offer. Then the United States did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, which actually was, you can say, the first major effort to arrest the climate change that we now face as a result of environmental degradation. America is not a party to the Kyoto Protocol. The United States continues to retain a very large defense budget, in fact, the largest defense budget, and its defense preparedness is designed to ensure that it can prevent any nuclear attack on the mainland United States from any part of the world. Now, it continues to retain its hold on the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, as I mentioned. It also continues to be a technological superpower. So these are the plus sides of the US hegemony and so on and so forth. But then why am I saying that in that case unipolarity is giving way to multipolarity? For reasons which I will just mention now. Analysts now think, as I said, that the US is a declining power. It is the world's largest debtor nation. I hope you understand what is meant by the word debtor nation. That means it owes the largest amount of debt to the world, to various agencies, various countries in various ways, and so on and so forth. Financial analysts actually have projected that China will overtake the United States as the largest economy of the world by 2050. In fact, according to some estimates, it might happen even 15 or 20 years earlier than that. That means sometime between 2030 and 2035. These are all essentially estimates. Apart from that, there are other limits on American power. You are all familiar with the fact that the United States actually intervened in Iraq in 2003 and in Afghanistan earlier than that in 2001, but it has had to withdraw from these two theaters. And as a consequence, these two theaters, these two countries actually have been reduced to a very poor situation, resulting in anarchy and terrorism and so on and so forth. I also propose to deliver lectures on terrorism, so I will take up these issues in greater detail at that time. Then, of course, America has problems with Iran and North Korea. In fact, Iran's ambitions for acquiring nuclear weapons has always been an unwelcome feature of international relations in recent times, and the Western powers have been very determined actually to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. There has been a standoff, a very serious standoff between Iran and the United States and the rest of the Western world. But last July, an agreement was reached, as a result of which actually Iran agreed to limit its uranium enrichment facility, and thereby actually reducing the prospect of Iran emerging as a nuclear power in the near future. North Korea continues to be a greater headache for the United States. Therefore, I hope I have been able to make it clear why I have been talking about unipolarity giving way to multipolarity. In fact, in this context, I would like to dwell a little bit on the rise of China. In fact, the rise of China and India. In fact, these two countries are now very much in the focus of the world because of several factors. One is, of course, the demographic factor, that these are the two largest countries in terms of population. China's population happens to be 1.3 billion. India's population happens to be 1.25 billion. So they are the two largest demographic powers. And demography, that is population, today is considered by strategic experts as one of the most powerful factors, elements of power. Secondly, I think, if you look at their economies are also very large. In fact, China has an economy of $10.5 trillion. Which is not very far behind the United States. The United States has an economy of $16 trillion. India has an economy of about $2 trillion. So one can say considerably way back, from China. But nevertheless, actually, India has a large economy. It has a large market, and so therefore, China and India actually have emerged as not only big economies, big demographic powers. They are already large countries, large territories. But at the same time, actually, they have two large, very, very large military establishments. They are both nuclear powers. And actually, today, the world in the post-Cold War era, the emphasis has shifted from politics to economics. So therefore, in fact, these two countries have very large markets, where, for instance, the producers of the world, the manufacturers of the world actually will be hoping to sell their products. So therefore, these two countries are very much in the focus, and in fact, their strategic location in Asia is also a very important issue, an important point. Where you are located actually is very, very important. So I would like to conclude now by saying that the world is truly multipolar now. And I hope I have been able to make my case very clear over the last half an hour or so that I have spent. The US is no longer the undisputed single superpower of the early post-war, post-Cold War era. Of course, it remains the single most power, notably economically, and in many other fields of human activity. I have already referred to them. Technologically, in fact, technologically, the United States continues to be a superpower, and it is, in fact, the most innovative country in terms of technological innovations, as probably might be already known to you. So, in these areas, the United States continues to maintain its lead and its leadership, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we must take note of the fact that other centers of power also have emerged, notably China, which will, of course, be the largest competitor that the United States will have in Asia, particularly in Asia. Apart from that, I have also noted that there are other powers like India, Russia. Russia actually has, incidentally, I have not had much of a chance actually to talk about the re-emergence of Russia as a big factor in world politics. Particularly after Vladimir Putin became the president of Russia in 2001. And currently, of course, the United States and Russia, they are embroiled in some kind of a confrontation over Ukraine, over Syria, and so on and so forth. And finally, of course, Europe continues to be an important, European Union continues to be an important entity, an important economic power, trading power, and so on and so forth. And of course, Japan. Japan had emerged even during the Cold War period as a very powerful economy. In fact, only until very recent times, Japan was the second largest economy in the world, but then it was overtaken by China. So therefore, Japan continues to be the third largest economy in the world. So obviously, I hope you understand in the context of what I have said that there has been a shift from politics to economics in the post-Cold War era. And so therefore, countries which actually are large economies will obviously call the shots in the period, in the foreseeable future, and of course the future thereafter. Thank you.